Thank you so much for joining me tonight. I'm sure everybody watching this channel knows who you are. You were an integral part of my childhood growing up, and you started off on a couple of books that, when I was a kid, really got no love, but in the last few years, especially, have come into some serious prominence on Silver Surfer, especially. And I was wondering, how did you get hooked up with Marvel originally?
Jim Starlin was the one who kind of took me by the hand and showed me around at Marvel, introduced me to people, co-wrote my first few gigs with me. He was the one who said, "Hey, do you want to, would you like to try writing comics?" Duh, yeah. Because Jim and I were friends. I was like a 22-year-old kid, 23 years old, working at the local newspaper. I just graduated from college, and Jim and I were friends, along with, Bernie Wrightson and Terry Austin, Fred Hembeck, the whole sort of Hudson Valley, upstate New York comics community. So that's who I hung out with. Dan Green, Joe Staten. It was just a whole nest of creative people near where I grew up in Kingston, New York. Those were the guys that I hung out with, and Jim was the one who said, "Hey, do you want to think about doing this?" Because I had copy edited his first prose novel for him, and he was pleased enough with the results that he said, "Well, you could do this. You could put food on the table writing comics." And so, okay, so he showed me how to write a script, and I got it. Like, I could get the format, the sort of the mentality of breaking down your story into pictures, into still images, was something that I could do. And I think all these years later, I tend to think that that's either a thing you get or a thing you don't get. You can teach it, and frankly, I do teach it. For some comic book writing classes at the Jacob Kruger studio out of New York. But it's a hell of a lot easier if your brain just works in pictures. If your brain only works in like moving pictures instead of still pictures, it's a lot harder to learn the format. So thankfully, I could do it. I was capable of doing it, and Marvel liked what I was doing well enough to start giving me solo work, and I've literally been doing it for 31 years ever since.
How did you end up on Silver Surfer? Was that just through Starlin's connections, kind of through the cosmic section, or?
Yeah, Jim was writing Surfer at the time, and co-wrote a few issues with me. I filled in on a few issues when he had other stuff going on. And then when Jim left the Surfer book to do Infinity Gauntlet, which obviously that turned out to be a pretty good career move for him. That turned out okay. So he left to do Infinity Gauntlet and start the Warlock and the Infinity Watch series. So he talked Marvel into handing me the Surfer book. So that was, I don't know, maybe a year into me doing this initially, maybe even less. So that was my first regular assignment. I'm sure there was some arm twisting from Jim to get my foot in the door doing a monthly book, but I started on Surfer and wrote 50 some issues consecutively. So it was a good fit, even though it was a character that I had not didn't have a feeling on one way or the other. It wasn't like I was a huge cosmic fan or anything like that, other than the stuff that Jim was doing. But turned out to be a good fit and I had a great learning experience on it, sort of figuring out how the hell to do this job while I was doing the job.
It seems like you learned really well. A lot of people who came into the industry, because that was right around the, like, I think 1990, 91, where you were first
Right.
starting on Surfer, right? And then by 93, the bottom, was completely falling out of the industry. And a lot of guys who had started in the industry at that point completely floundered and disappeared. You, on the other hand, it seems like you were very good at making connections. You were working simultaneously for Marvel, and you worked on Marvel DC. Plus, you were doing Stormwatch for Jim Lee while you were still working for Marvel, which is something that I know Jim Valentino and Eric Larson both tried to pull off and couldn't do. Did you learn? Jim Starlin, I know, has had a rather tumultuous relationship with Marvel, to say the least. Did you learn? Did any of that kind of intuitive nature for your career come from learning from Jim?
Well, I mean, certainly being around people like Jim and Bernie Wrightson and Terry Austin, Joe Staten, like people who had been doing this since the 70s, right? And having access to their wisdom of, when I broke in, like everything was selling like crazy. I mean, when I took over the Surfer on a monthly basis, it was selling 300,000 copies an issue, which just like by today's standard just seems nuts, right? So the royalties were amazing. Like everything was selling. So, so I had the wisdom of Jim and Bernie and the other guys telling me it doesn't always go like this. Like this is not how things work all the time. There are waves and troughs, and the waves are great and you ride those, and the troughs you just try to get through. So I had some basis of understanding of the ebb and flow of the business, and also how you worked both sides of the street at Marvel and DC, and I didn't have a career plan by any means, but I did have people who were who would give me advice and give me a hand. This is a very social business. It was then, it still is now, but even more so then, it was social because Marvel and DC were not that far from each other. And I think when I started at Marvel, Marvel and DC were less than 20 blocks from each other. So like everybody at the offices knew each other. They were friends. They played softball with each other and against each other. If you got into that mix, you met people who would eventually hire you over at DC, and so it was still a very very social thing. And I'd already been a professional journalist since I was basically like 18, even in college. So I had a sense of how to comport myself, and I'd been taught that deadlines mattered, and all of the stuff that you should know before you ever set foot in this business. But some people don't get that education. Like I had all those, I had the leg up on all that stuff. So and also it's not that unusual back then to be writing a Marvel book and a DC book and an Image book. I mean, there was, for a while I was writing a monthly Marvel book, a monthly DC book, and a monthly Image book, all at the same time, which was cool, which was great. But it didn't seem, weird to me. It didn't, it wasn't like miraculous. Now, of course, you don't really get to work both sides of the street at the same time. It's not that usual, because the companies sort of jealously guard their plans and what they're doing, and exclusive contracts are much more are much more a tool to kind of keep people in one place for a few years than they were back then. So it was, I just had fun. I mean, as offers came in, I sorted through them and decided which ones were the ones to take, and mostly you just took on the things that sounded kind of cool.
Fair enough. I specialize in like careers in the early 90s, and you see some people that pulled off what you did, writing monthly titles for two or three people once or twice, but it just seems like you're very good at maintaining relationships, and your career is kind of built on that momentum over the years. It's really cool to have watched you kind of interweave with all these different companies. I mean, you were involved with Valiant, Exo Man of War super early at what, 95, I think, were you on that series?
Probably 90, 94 or something like that. Whenever the unfortunately named Birthquake event took place is when I was at Valiant. And that was, again, just because I had, I met a guy who knew a guy who knew a guy, and everybody kind of introduced people around. And I got into Valiant because I was friends with Bart Sears, and Bart was being brought back to Valiant after the huge success of his Turok stuff. They were sort of relaunching Valiant with 2 titles a month or 2 issues a month. That was the plan, to do 2 books a month for the whole Valiant line. Which, like, in the scheme of things now, it doesn't seem quite so crazy, but back then it was like, what are you, nuts? Like, there's not an appetite for it. But that plan was put into place when the boom time was on in comics. So the idea was like, let's publish as many books as we can in this period while the boom is still on. So I got brought into that by Bart introducing me to the people at Valiant, which was Steve Masarsky and Bob Layton. And we just, it was very casual, and we just kind of did a deal and negotiated frankly, a fairly fat page rate, because Valiant had a lot of money to spend at that point. And I, honestly, I loved writing that book. I really, really liked the character and the concept and all that stuff. And eventually I ended up leaving the book just because I had too much work elsewhere. And my, what prompted it ultimately was the fact that that Marvel versus DC was offered to me. And it was, obviously it's not a job that you would turn down. And something in my schedule had to go, because we had to get the Marvel versus DC stuff done, immediately. They wanted to get that project out as soon as humanly possible. So something in my schedule had to go. And the fact that XO was 2 issues a month sort of made it the obvious one that if I carved that out of my schedule, I could take on Marvel versus DC and the amalgam stuff and have enough time to devote to that to make it what we wanted it to be. And also, I mean, honestly, I also had the sense that there was an ill wind blowing at Valiant, because cracks were starting to appear in how things were working. And I thought, man, I don't know that this place is going to be long for the world. And it obviously, Valiant lasted a fair amount longer, but I just had a sense that that all was not well. And to a certain extent, I guess I was proven right, because Valiant had sold itself to Acclaim, sort of on inflated sales numbers and all that, and then Acclaim sort of figured out that they had purchased a pig in a poke, and eventually the whole thing kind of fell apart. But that notwithstanding, man, I really loved writing XO, and it's one of the things that I look back on and feel like, man, if I only could have stayed, another year or so and gotten a bunch more issues out, because I really liked it. But obviously, if the choice was XO or Marvel versus DC, the choice was obvious.
So speaking of Marvel DC, obligatory little bit of discussion. I have one curious question for you. I have read a urban myth that there was at one point supposed to be like DC and Marvel editorial, like you said, actually got along really well. And most people do not understand this. They think like, Marvel and DC is like just hating each other and always taking cheap shots, which has not always been the case. And there was like initially at one point a plan where there were going to be characters swapped between universes.
Right.
Is that true?
Yeah, that's true. It was discussed. It never went terribly far up the chain of command. It was discussed, and one of the chief reasons the whole project came together, other than Marvel and DC wanted to do something that would benefit the direct market and keep stores open, because, like you said, the bottom had dropped out. There was a huge crash in the direct market after this huge bubble, and stores had over-ordered. They had gone whole hog on stuff like the Reign of the Supermen storyline and X-Men #1 and X-Force #1. So they had just cases of material that they had paid for and were never going to sell. So something needed to keep the doors open. So that's where Marvel versus DC came from. And the architects of it were Mike Carlin at DC and Mark Grunwald at Marvel, who were like best friends, had worked had both worked together at Marvel, and so they were the perfect guys to bridge that gap and put the whole project together. Um, so part of the discussion, once we had figured out what the project was going to be and that the amalgam books were going to get done, was that maybe at the end of the whole thing, to again bolster interest, was that maybe two characters would stay behind, would be swapped into either universe, and the characters that were discussed were Martian Manhunter on the DC side and She-Hulk on the Marvel side, because those characters were somewhat redundant in their own universes. She-Hulk was, Lady Hulk. We already got Hulk. And Martian Manhunter was in some ways kind of, an amalgamation of other heroes, principally Superman. But he was sort of like Superman, but green with a brow, and his kryptonite was fire. And I love Martian Manhunter. I think he's a terrific character. But in terms of his power set, he was somewhat redundant for the DC universe. So the idea was that if those two characters swapped, they would be much more unique in the other universe. So the notion was that they would swap, stay for a year, and then maybe two more characters. Then they would go back to where they came from, and then two more characters would be swapped. Ultimately, the legalities of it and the copyrights and all of that stuff just ended up being too complex for anybody to really want to go to the mat and figure it out. But would have been cool. It would have been who knows? Martian Manhunter is one of the Avengers, and She-Hulk in the Justice League. So somewhere there's an alternate universe where that happened.
So I have to ask, Mark Grunwald happens to be like a personal hero. He's one of the guys who got me he made me fall in love with everything about the industry. Was he involved? Was like that? Where did the idea for swapping those characters come from? Do you know? Because that sounds like something that Mark.
I suspect it was Mike and Mark who maybe just kicked the idea around. Because at the formative stage of the project, we were literally in Grunwald's apartment uptown in Manhattan, because they didn't want us meeting in either office. They didn't want us to be seen by the editorial staffs, or they would, maybe they would start to figure out something was going on. Obviously, this is pre-internet, so it wouldn't have spread like wildfire, but it would have gotten out. So we actually met at Mark's apartment, and then at a Mexican restaurant around the corner from his place, where all of this stuff got kind of figured out. I don't know that we discussed, maybe we discussed sort of, would it be cool if we could leave behind a character? Just in a very, sort of, ephemeral way. At that point, I think those guys kind of went back to their respective offices and ran it up the flagpole to the publisher level, and it ultimately was decided that that's probably not going to work.
I was just curious because I know with the original creation of the Squadron Supreme, I did a video about Squadron Supreme, and when I was looking into that, it was pretty interesting because there was originally supposed to be a Justice League Avengers swap over, and that's where Squadron came from, and Mark was kind of obsessed with that, and that's where that whole miniseries came out.
The Imperial Guard. There's a fine tradition of we'd actually like your characters to appear in our books, but we can't do that, so we're just gonna pretend that these characters we made up are fairly close to what you've got.
Sorry, don't want to beat a dead horse. I was just curious. It's kind of like one of those urban myths that I read a lot about. Had a chance to ask you about it. Mark happens to be a personal hero of mine. So getting back into your career, like right around the time of all of this, you're also doing Green Lantern. And I'll admit, like as a kid, I happen to be not so like I was a huge fan of Hal Jordan. So I was like totally crushed by Kyle Rayner. And I hated on him for so many years. And when I started the channel, I've gone back and read a lot of stuff. And man, I cannot read most Hal Jordan stuff anymore but that Kyle Rayner stuff is gold. Can you talk a little bit about where Kyle Rayner kind of came from? I love the artistic concept. Every play on it is just awesome. Can you talk a little bit about Kyle?
The short answer is we just made him up. I mean, that's what it really comes down to is we were given the opportunity to just make up a new Green Lantern. Uh, the Emerald Twilight storyline was sort of given to us in the sense of here's the broad strokes. Here's what's going to happen to Hal. Literally like a page and a half of notes they gave me to make those 3 issues, because the decision was arrived at fairly late. The decision that because there was an existing issue 48, 49, and 50 of Green Lantern that had been started to be drawn. Darryl Banks had actually started to draw some of those issues, and the decision was finally made that this isn't going to work. This is not, the Green Lantern franchise was not resonating with readers. They were sales were not good. Sort of Gray Temple Hal was not a character that the audience was responding to. So the decision was ultimately made, I'm sure spurred by the success of Death of Superman and the Breaking of Batman. Okay, well, let's do something similar in the Green Lantern franchise, but let's have it be permanent. So editorial kind of came up with the broad strokes of Emerald Twilight, and I wrote those issues all together. Frankly, I wrote them all at once because they needed to be drawn all at once, because by the time the decision was made to go in that direction, we were late. So I wrote basically half a dozen pages of issue 48, half a dozen pages of issue 49, half a dozen pages of issue 50, and then went back and finished them off because we had 3 artists and they all needed to be working at once. The books needed to be done. So it was a little juggling, but I was not completely unused to that from working on Surfer, where it was, I was keeping a number of artists working at the same time. So sometimes you write stuff out of order. And then at the end of the notes that I was given by editorial, it was, and a new Green Lantern is created. And that's it. I mean, that's all of the direction that we were given. And I asked on a phone call if the new lead character could be a woman. And they were like, nope, we'd like to keep it a male lead. And I asked if it could be an alien. And they said, nope, should be somebody from Earth. And other than that, those were the only parameters that I had. So I went back to the kind of characters that I dug as a kid. And I was mostly a Marvel reader as a kid. I was interested in, the Marvel's more flawed heroes. The adage is that Marvel's heroes have internal flaws and DC's heroes have external ones. Superman has kryptonite. The aforementioned Martian Manhunter has fire. Everybody, like all the DC heroes, have a weakness that's generally outside. And all the Marvel heroes have a weakness that's internal. Iron Man's got a bad ticker, and Thor in his civilian guise walks with a cane, and Daredevil's blind. And so everybody has some sort of internal flaw, and that stuff appealed to me more as a kid. It resonated more with me. And the one that resonated the most was Spider-Man, because you could see yourself in Spider-Man. Peter Parker's life outside of the costume was just as interesting as his life in the costume. Who he was going to date, and if he was going to be able to, make the rent because J. Jonah Jameson was holding out his pay, and, Aunt May's heart medicine ran out and he had to get more. Like all of the stuff that you got involved in Peter Parker's life was to me half the story. Was why you rooted for him. So when it became my job to make up a new Green Lantern, I went in the Peter Parker direction. I went in the flawed hero direction. And I wanted to do a hero that was unlike a lot of the DC heroes. The DC heroes are very much aspirational. They are the people you look up to rather than the person you see when you look in the mirror. So I figured if the plan was to move Hal out of the main character role in Green Lantern, if he was not the attraction anymore, that we should do a hero as unlike Hal as possible. So Hal is Chuck Yeager. He's a hero before he ever gets the Green Lantern ring. He's a test pilot. So I wanted somebody who was not really capable of doing the job yet. I wanted somebody who had to learn the job, and somebody who would make mistakes and grow into it, and somebody that you could see yourself in. He was the everyman archetype, and DC didn't have a lot of those characters at the time. So that's where Kyle came from, and the fact that he's an artist. To me, that was an obvious direction to go in, because Green Lantern's a special effects book. Part of the big attraction to Green Lantern is, well, what kind of cool shit is he going to make with the ring this time? So that was a big draw to me for why you would read the book. So the natural inclination was to have somebody with a very visual mind and a big imagination to have the ring, so that we weren't doing boxing gloves anymore.
Well, the character had every opportunity to be edgelord crap and just be derivative and try to buy it. Reign of the Superman had come just years before, and we saw they pandered to everything in that. And Kyle Rayner has proven to be, when he was reborn as Ion, and even now, I think he retains so much attention because he's an actual character, which is what Green Lantern was sorely lacking at the time. So I was curious. It's really cool to hear that was one of the things you set out to rectify with the character.
Right. Well, we tried to build him into somebody that you cared about, whether he was in the costume or not. Like you were engaged by his story and his life, and you would root for him, whether he was trying to pay the rent or doing a design job that he had to get to the publisher, whatever that was, whatever those parameters were. We wanted him to be somebody that you liked, and we also wanted him to be somebody that had to grow into the role, which is why, like, for the first half dozen issues, he's kind of a jerk. He's kind of an idiot, and because obviously getting this magic ring is basically like winning the lottery. It's just, he just gets handed this most glorious prize in the universe, and he can do anything he wants. So there has to be the obvious, great power, great responsibility thing for him as well, because otherwise it's just like winning the lottery.
All right, interesting. He is a character that interests me to know. In growing up, I did not give him near enough the respect, and the more I go back and read, the more I find that he's kind of laid out everything that goes wrong with every freaking Green Lantern series reboot they try to do with Hal Jordan or even Alan Scott. It's just so. Moving on from there, in the 90s, you bounced around a lot. You worked for you have worked for Devil's Due, you've worked for Dynamite at this point, right? You worked for CrossGen. Was there anything during that bridge? Because you would then obviously go on to sign a contract with Top Cow, and you were on Darkness for 70 issues, I think, something like that.
Witchblade. I was on.
I said Darkness. I am so sorry. Yes.
Witchblade actually, Darkness was the first thing I did for Top Cow. When I left CrossGen, because the seams were coming apart there, and it was very obvious that it wasn't going to last. So I took my exit, and in fairly short order, Jim McLaughlin, who was the editor in chief at Top Cow at the time, and whom I had known for years from him being at Wizard, called and said, "Hey, what do you want to do for us?" And we discussed different things. And then he said, "Well, how about, can you do like an arc on the Darkness and sort of, it'll kind of be our first date, see how we like each other." And so I did a Darkness arc, and then they offered me Witchblade. And I had, honestly never read an issue of Witchblade in my life. Like, I obviously knew what it was and had a very good sense of the perception of it in the marketplace and all that. And so I said, "Well, look, send me issues of Witchblade." So, in 2 days later, a huge box gets unloaded off of a UPS truck in my driveway, and I sat down and read a bunch of Witchblade issues, and then we had another discussion of, like, I was like, "Look, if you guys want these issues to be more of what a good chunk of that run was, which is, oh, she's running around in a metal bikini, check her out." I was like, "I'm not the person that you should hire to do that, because that's not what I do, and it's not what I'm interested in. But if you want me to, try to, no pun intended, if you want me to try to put some flesh on these bones and, make Sarah Pizzini into a character that resonates with the audience and has, sort of a more three-dimensional life, let's give it a try." And they, to my everlasting thanks from Top Cow, they were just like, "Yeah, do what you do. Like, we're hiring you to do the thing that you do." So that was the last time we ever discussed, like what her costume was going to look like, or if it was going to be sexy or any of that stuff. They just said, tell the story that you want to tell. And, as is often the case, the book that you don't really expect to be a fit for you, or that you don't have any preconceived notions about, turns out to be the best fit. And I ended up doing, I don't know, probably all told, with specials and stuff like that, like over 100 issues of Witchblade. Just because I found out that I love the character, I love the world that she inhabited, and the character and the concept were elastic enough that I could tell any kind of story. We could do horror stuff, supernatural stuff, crime stuff, police procedural stuff, superhero stuff. I could tell, any kind of stories that I wanted to, and I worked with a bunch of great artists on the book. So it was, from start to finish, it was just a pleasure for me.
It was an awesome read. I had never been an inordinately large fan of the character because I didn't feel like there was much of a character. And then I ended up getting a couple of trades from a buddy who was like, "No, man, you really have to read this later stuff." And I was really blown away with what you did with it was kind of harkens back to your Green Lantern work, where I just feel like you're injecting a love for the character in there. And that's really interesting to hear, that you don't come into these characters with a certain like affinity or fanboy love with them, because a lot of people approach every single project that they do like that, and I see it blow up in a lot of people's faces. So that's very interesting to hear.
Yeah, I mean, Surfer, Green Lantern, and Witchblade, I didn't come to with any sense of, "Oh my God, this is the book that I've always wanted to write." Now, look, virtually any book you get your hands on is cool, because this is a cool job. But like I got a chance to do Thor, which is one of the characters that I love, and I love that whole world. I love Simonson's run beyond most anything else. And my year on Thor was not very good. So that was the lesson to me, that sometimes you come into a thing and you are too close to it to really be able to do the things on the book that you need to do to make it a compelling read every month.
Interesting. I always love hearing about people's processes and approaches. So that's
it's very situation by situation is very different. Like, I'm a huge Star Wars fan. I grew up Star Wars hit me when I was just about 12 years old. So I grew up on that stuff, and like seeing that movie in 1977 was like a life-changing experience. So when I got the chance to do Star Wars comics for Dark Horse, I immediately said yes. I mean, Dark Horse actually offered me the first regular Star Wars series, but I had just signed an exclusive contract on. I think that was probably for DC. Yeah, I think it was for DC at the time. So I literally just signed an exclusive with DC, and then like a week later, Dark Horse says, "Hey, would you like to launch the first Star Wars monthly that we're going to do?" So that's when you want to walk in front of a bus. But like I got to do plenty of Star Wars stuff over the years, and I loved it all. And I think it turned out pretty good. I think I feel more strongly about my Star Wars stuff by far than I do about Thor stuff. Sometimes stuff clicks and sometimes it doesn't. And I think a lot of it has to do with the editor you're working for and the artist you're working with. And, it's a little bit like alchemy, and like there's no one formula that makes stuff work or makes stuff fall apart. But when you get the right people in place and the right pieces in place, things just work. And it's like I said, it's a pleasure.
So you've had a number of really lengthy, good runs on titles. Are there any books that you got completely cut short on that you wish that you had planned out that you really wish you could have ran with?
Well, like I said, I mean, I would have liked to do more EXO, but it just wasn't in the cards at the time. And honestly, I would have done more Thor. And I think the second year would have been much better than the first year, but I couldn't get on the same page with the editor who kept changing his mind about, well, the next year Thor should be on Earth. No, wait, the next year Thor should be in space. So there was no firm direction on where Marvel as a publisher wanted that character to go. And I had plenty of stuff that I wanted to do. And actually there was a plan in place, and I was going to work with artist Tom Grinberg, who drew some of my Marvel stuff, some of my DC stuff, and is a very sort of Frazetta-esque kind of artist. So we had a bunch of more Asgardian stuff and outer space stuff, and just more sort of fantasy adventure stuff that we were going to do for the second year, and was stuff that I really wanted. I was really looking forward to. But I could never get the editor was not going to sign off on it, and because he didn't know what he wanted. So eventually, I just there was enough angst involved in the whole thing that I eventually said, maybe we should just part ways, and you can get somebody who's more attuned to what you want, and I can go do things where I have a little bit freer hand.
And one last, just like little fanboy question. Is there any series that you've done, you have worked on an inordinate amount of stuff, and I do not want to spend forever, asking you about stuff. You've done so many interviews, and I don't want to waste your time asking you questions you've been asked a million times before. Is there any series that you've worked on that people don't ask you about or you don't get a chance to talk about that you'd like to talk about?
Boy, I don't know. It's odd for me to say, hey, we should talk about this cool thing that I did.
Well, no, I just mean,
but I think that I guess the real answer to that is it's usually the stuff that's like your creator-owned stuff, the stuff that you build from the ground floor up, and obviously doesn't have the cachet for the most part. Creator-owned material just like doesn't have the cachet of Batman or X-Men or anything like that. Because they're not these cultural icons. But I think a lot of times those are the books that that creators are hold a little nearer and dearer to their hearts because it didn't exist before. So I think probably still, if not my favorite, at least one of my favorite things I've ever done is called Samurai Heaven and Earth, which is a Dark Horse series that I did with Luke Ross. It has, I was going to say it has 2 trade paperbacks out, but they're both out of print. The rights actually reverted to Luke and me, so we can kind of do whatever we want with it. So I was actually supposed to have a call with Luke this evening, but he pulled a really long deadline. He was like, "Dude, I got to sleep." So in the next few days, Luke and I will be talking about perhaps a little bit more samurai.
Most excellent. I had never checked it out. I didn't know much about your Dark Horse work. I had read the Tarzan Batman and the Batman Alien stuff, obviously, but I looked it up, after we spoke, and I was quite pleasantly surprised. So that's cool to hear that you guys got the rights back to it, and you might be doing something. If you guys end up doing something, I might pester you.
I would love to be pestered. It's we had actually planned on doing a third. So for anybody that doesn't know, Samurai Heaven and Earth is about a 17th century samurai who pursues the love of his life, who has been kidnapped and taken initially to the court of Louis XIV to be a courtesan, which is a nice word for prostitute that we say. So she was basically sold into slavery. So he crosses Asia and the European continent to find her. So the first volume, he finds her in Versailles. And at that time period in Versailles, or at least in Paris, there were the Three Musketeers. So he encounters the Three Musketeers and seeks his lost love. And then in the second volume, she is spirited away by the series villain, who is a Spaniard, who is obsessed with her and takes her to Egypt. And there's a lot of blood on the sand by the time they get to Egypt. And then the third one, which we actually did start, the first issue written for the third volume, takes them to the Caribbean. In that era, obviously, we're dealing with the golden age of piracy. So there are characters, both historical and literary, of a pirate nature that will appear in the third volume.
I'm a huge fan of historical fiction, and I had never heard of that series somehow. So when I checked it out, it's like, how have I never heard of it? It's awesome that you guys are coming. Well, fingers crossed we get that third book. And when we get that third book, I will definitely be hitting you up about it. And speaking of new books, so the way we got put in touch is through Zoop. And I am inordinately curious about what your how it's like been what it's like been working with Zoop. They seem like they have a very interesting business plan. It's something that I've kind of seen in my own head over the last few years, building with crowdsource funding. And for anybody who's not familiar, as I know it's just kicking off, it is basically like a crowdfunding, Kickstarter, Indiegogo type deal, but aimed towards comic books and specifically towards getting books with professional industry veterans. I know Bart Sears has got Heads Will Roll is coming out. You've got a series with Andy Lanning that's coming out. There was some really interesting stuff coming out from Zoop. How did you get hooked up with them, and what has been like working with them?
I've known Jordan Plosky from Zoop for a number of years. I don't even remember how we met, but it's one of those things where sort of eventually everybody in comics knows everybody, because you stumble into each other at a convention, or you know a guy who introduces you to that guy. So I think back in the spring, Jordan reached out to me and said, "Hey, my next venture is where this crowdfunding platform that's going to be comic centric. It's like Kickstarter, it's like Indiegogo, but it's just for comics. It's for comics and comic art, and it's got a very specific demographic that they're trying to target." So I said, and he asked me, is there anything that you want to, anything that you would want do on this platform once we get it up and running. So so I said, sure, let me take a look at it and see what we can come up with. And I got a hold of Andy Lanning, who has been a friend for, I don't know, 25 years or something like that. And Andy and I have worked on stuff together before, and have co-written a bunch of stuff. Most recently, the DC Endless Winter crossover that came out in December last year. Andy and I co-wrote the whole thing, something like 9 issues and 200 pages or something like that. So we have very similar story sensibilities, and we have similar tastes in what we think makes a good comic. So so Andy and I are actually working on a number of different projects together, some of which have been announced and some of which haven't. So the one that ended up on Zoop is called Resolution, and it is a cosmic graphic novel about an interstellar corps of heroes, and about one hero in particular who is retired from service, who has left the service and wants just to be left alone, just wants to live out the rest of her life in privacy and solitude, but gets pulled back in, of course. So the short version of Resolution is that we tell people is that it's basically Unforgiven meets the Green Lantern Corps. So it's a big time space opera story, but with a lot of examination of nature of heroism and the costs of heroism, plus a lot of cool outer space explosions and stuff like that. So Andy and I are co-writing, and Rick Leonardi, who is a genius, is also one of my buddies, is penciling, and Andy is inking Rick. So and Andy and Rick have worked together before on a few things. And it's just a really terrific combination. Not only is Andy a really good writer, but he's a tremendous inker. So it seemed like a really good fit to, with the three of us handling those roles. And certainly Rick contributing to the story as well, Rick designing stuff and coming up with ideas and characters and everything. So so it's very much a kind of a three-headed monster here. So the campaign is up and running right now, and hopefully in a couple of weeks we'll be funded, and then early next year we'll have the thing out. It'll be basically, it's the first book of what we hope will be at least 3 stories with these characters. And it's it's kind of what Andy and I are known for in a lot of ways. I mean, me with Silver Surfer and Green Lantern, and Andy with Guardians of the Galaxy and Nova, Annihilation, Legion of Superheroes. So we have both tilled the soil in the cosmic end of both Marvel and DC universes. So we felt like there would hopefully be an audience for us doing that stuff again. And I'm really thrilled with the story that we came up with. I think it's and bringing Rick in to breathe life into it is just a sheer joy. He's terrific.
I'm really hoping that Rick, I've heard he's a bit reclusive, but I'm hoping Rick will talk to me. I've been a huge fan of his work for a long, long time. I'm very excited to read the book. And I wanted to point out that when I read the synopsis, my head jumped to Green Lantern, but when I saw a little bit, little bit more about the book, it's much more than that too. I think it draws a lot on your creator-owned, like the kind of the feel of the Heaven and Earth, that large, expansive universe, as well as the characters. So I'm really looking forward to checking that out.
Hopefully, it's ultimately what we do best. You should come to the book and end up caring about not only the main character who's named Zan Maddox, but the rest. There's a supporting cast, and there's frankly a pretty damn good villain that is her arch nemesis, and was an antagonist for her for her entire career, and they will, they will face off one more time. So it's yeah, I mean, there's spaceships and big battles and cosmic power and all sorts of stuff like that, but hopefully that's kind of the window dressing, and it's really a, it's got some characters that hopefully people will respond to and want to come back and read about.
Most of your writing always, that is what appeals to me, is there's great visuals, there's usually a very, if not amazing, extremely solid artist doing whatever, but your writing is just, it pulls you into a world. You build very coherent casts of characters as well, which I think is super important, because I think so many superheroes just get lost with zero supporting. There's nothing around them. They're floating in this nebulous world. They exist in this universe where it's like everybody else exists, but no one else exists, except for when we want things to.
Well, I think, I've always approached my writing from sort of character first standpoint. And I think if you give the audience characters that they care about and can connect to, then all the crazy shit that happens, whether it's cosmic stuff or supernatural stuff or whatever, like, the audience goes with you. If the characters feel real, the audience is much more accepting of all the other stuff that happens. So my goal is, first and foremost, to always build characters that that the reader has an affinity for, if not, and certainly, like, not every character is one that you're supposed to like. I'm working on a serial for heavy metal called Swamp God, and it's got Union soldiers and Confederate soldiers. So look, you're not really supposed to like the Confederate soldiers. They're not good people. But you can at least sympathize with them a little bit, and you can at least understand and hopefully react to them as real people. Even though they're not the heroes. So I like characters who have a lot of shades of gray. The ones who are purely black or purely white, in terms of their sort of good evil alignment, to me, are not that interesting. I think the villains, I always like the Marvel villains more than the DC villains for the most part, because they were, to a certain extent, they were, at the very least, they were the heroes of their own stories. Like Magneto and Doctor Doom think they're the stuff that they do, they're doing for the right reasons. That was sort of the model for Hal Jordan becoming Parallax, is that, we didn't want him to be seen as a villain per se. We wanted him to be seen as someone who believed in what he was doing, but what he was doing was diametrically opposed to what most of the heroes wanted. He was, in my mind, he was very much a Magneto-like character.
That makes absolute sense. I'd never put that together. But I think that speaks to how little, you say, I characterize him as a, Marvel character, but I just think you just have a way of thinking about characters that breathes a life into them all their own. That's really interesting. Sorry. So that's kind of a mind blower. I have to admit, as a kid, I was such a big Hal Jordan fan that when I read that, I was just like, threw the page, came out comic down in nerd rage. It's taken me 20 years to get over that. But there, you mentioned you had a few other things coming out, like you're working on Swamp Gods. What else? You are so prolific. It is absolutely impossible to keep up with everything that you're doing, man. It is insane. What else have you got cooking that you can talk about?
Let me see. Swamp God is in Heavy Metal every month. Starting in September, I'm doing a 5-issue mini called Almost American, which is the true life spy story of two ex-Russian intelligence operatives who ended up coming to America because they had to flee Russia. I'm telling what is basically their true life story. So, and so these are real people who now live in the United States, and like I'm friends with the guy. I'm friends with Jan Newman, who has this is his story. So so I actually just talked to him on the phone earlier today. So it's kind of weird when your like Russian spy friend calls you. So this is this is their life story of being intelligence operatives, being in with the FSB and the Russian banking system, and then eventually that going south and having to escape to Central America, to the Caribbean, and eventually come to the United States and build new lives. So that's a 5-issue miniseries coming out from Aftershock called Almost American, drawn by Marco Castiello, who's a terrific Italian artist. And then I've actually got some other projects that I'm doing with Jan, because we've hit it off and we like telling stories and comics that haven't been announced yet, but there's some cool stuff coming. The heavy metal stuff is drawn by an Italian artist named Paolo Armitano, who is just fabulous. In fact, when we're done, I have to write more pages from him because he's almost out. And the number one rule in comics is make sure your artist is always working. And then there's other stuff that I'm doing that I can't really talk about. So but there's cool stuff coming. I don't know that when it's going to be. Probably a few months it'll be announced. And it's the life of a writer in this business is constant juggling, because you're always working on, well, I was going to say 3 or 4 different projects, but probably like 5 or 6 or 7 different projects is what it really amounts to. And then I'm doing some video game stuff too. So there's which I don't know that I'm not supposed to talk about it, but I don't know that I am supposed to talk about it. So I'll just keep my mouth shut. But it's a cool video game that'll be out in a couple of years, and I'm very pleased to be working on that as well.
Awesome. Well, I'll be keeping an eye out on, well, I always keep an eye out for your name, but I'll be stalking your page. And when we get a couple of new things coming out, I might hit you up, and have you back on and try to get some more word out about some other cool stuff and pester you about a few more things. I will leave you alone for the night. I have but one more question. You talked twice about Bernie Wrightson. Bernie, like, absolutely is one of the most talented individuals to have ever worked in the industry. And I don't think that he gets nearly the respect from the generation past mine that he deserves. Did you work with Bernie on anything?
Oh yeah, Bernie and I worked on Batman Aliens. I think was the first thing we did together. We did some short stories. We did an issue of Batman that Kevin Nolan inked, called Splash, that actually sat in a drawer up at DC for 15 years and eventually got printed. It eventually got printed as its own special. So yeah, Bernie and I, worked on stuff together and lived a mile and a half down the road from each other. When I first was sort of in comics, I initially, I met Bernie when I was in high school. He was local to me, and I went out to his house to interview him for the high school newspaper, because I knew that Bernie Wrightson is out. He's out in Woodstock, New York, and that would be a cool interview to get. So he was in the phone book. I called him up and asked if I could interview him, and he said sure. And so I went out to his studio, and then when I got into college, I went out and did the same thing again. I did another interview for the college newspaper. And when I went out to Bernie's house to drop off copies of the newspaper, he was down in his studio. He had a huge detached studio. It was down the hill from the house, and it had been It actually was like 40 by 60. It was a really big building, and just like one of the coolest places ever. Just filled with toys and weird stuff on the shelves, and a human skeleton hanging from the rafters, and it was a very cool place to be. So when I dropped off the newspapers, Bernie said, "Hey, I'm having a Halloween party, next weekend. Do you want to come?" Well, yeah, of course. That's but you're like a 19-year-old kid being invited to what I came to realize was like a famous Halloween party. It was like Bernie's Halloween parties were a big deal every year. And he had him down in the studio, and the guests were like a who's who of people from comics. People from the city had come up and would come up to the parties. So I was actually kind of scared to go because I didn't know anybody and I'm just a kid, and but I kind of screwed up my courage and decided to go, and obviously just had a great time, met a bunch of people, because at a Halloween party it doesn't matter, nobody's who they are, right? Everybody's in costume. That was the only necessity, was you had to be in costume for the party. So that's where I met Starlin for the first time, and met a lot of these other guys, and just ended up being being friends with those guys, going to the movies, playing racquetball. So ultimately, I mean, Bernie's the one who, if I had never met Bernie, I wouldn't be doing this at all. At least I don't think so. I don't think that there's I don't think there's any way I would have broken into comics without the helping hand from Bernie and Jim. So I completely agree that to me Bernie's Frankenstein illustrations are maybe, if not the finest illustration done in the 20th century. Certainly, top 5, top 3. It's just breathtaking material, and I'm fortunate enough to have seen a lot of those originals in his studio when he still had them. So on the one hand, like Bernie Wrightson is, he's Bernie Wrightson. He's sort of legendary, right? But for the most part, he was just my buddy Bernie that, we played racquetball and, went to see shitty horror movies together and had pizza and beers after. And, same thing for Starlin, really. It's just like, you have to take a step back and remember who you're hanging out with. It's just a very separate thing. Like when I would go over and hang out at Bernie's studio, and even when we were working on Batman Aliens, like he's drawing my story, and I would go over to his studio and we'd look at the layouts, and he'd be drawing some stuff while I was there, and like you would get the reminder of, oh shit, this is Bernie Wrightson sitting here. It's not just some dude I know. And watching him draw was just like, I still remember it really well. Starlin actually said that that when Bernie draws, it's like the drawing is already there and he's just uncovering it. He said Bernie's less an artist than an archaeologist brushing sand away to expose what's always been there, which is a perfect way to describe it. He just drew. He could see it in his head, and he could put what was in his head on the page, and maybe he wasn't always satisfied with what went on the page, but everybody else was satisfied with it.
At a certain point, he stopped putting out comic book output like almost abruptly overnight. And I've heard a lot of references in old interviews that something happened to his wrist that caused him to completely have to relearn how to hold a pencil and draw. Is that true?
He had some wrist issues, and he had some vision issues. He could still draw. It just, he wasn't drawing at the clip that you need to draw for comics, because comics is a pretty brutal way to make a living for an artist. Comics is like, you got to be special forces to make that happen as a living. It's hard. And ultimately, I mean, Bernie ended up moving out to Los Angeles and doing a lot of film work, because it paid so much better, and it was much less grueling than comics. And he had always, he had done film work previously, even when he was when he was a mile and a half down the road from me. He had done, stuff on Ghostbusters, and like a whole litany of things. But he ended up moving out to LA to go more into the concept design stuff, because it was you could spend one day doing one drawing rather than one day trying to complete 6 panels of pencils. It was the film stuff was much more to his liking in terms of the pace of the work. And eventually he went back and did a bunch of comics, and a lot of the stuff that he produced with Steve Niles for IDW was just great. But yeah, I mean, look, he had some eye issues and some wrist issues, and most artists go through that, because this is it's a tough way to make a living.
I was just curious. I don't get a chance to talk to many people who knew Bernie very personally. Him and Catherine Jeffrey Jones are both just huge inspirations to me, just amazing artists. And there's kind of like almost an urban myth that at some point working on Frankenstein, he pushed himself too hard and basically went blind, and his wrist was all messed up, and he had to learn to rehold a pencil. And
Yeah, some of that might be sort of apocryphal. But yeah, obviously the Frankenstein stuff was grueling, and he was doing that mostly unpaid. He was doing that because he wanted to, and eventually Marvel agreed to put it out, and then there have been subsequent editions, and I think IDW is going to do an artist edition of the big plates. I know they announced it. I'm not sure when it's coming out. I have to get that.
they haven't announced when. It got announced at the same time when the Mr. A artist edition came out, and I got so excited.
That's really the size that stuff needs to be seen at. I have to admit, I saw that stuff at Bernie's studio, and now I've seen that stuff on museum walls. So it's a sort of a complete journey for that stuff. And obviously that's gonna, people will be looking at those plates 200 years from now.
They will. I think the record-setting number on that original piece of art that just sold for that two-page splash, 1.25 million plus. Like, we're just going to see that number exponentially increase. It's, as you said, I think it's some of the greatest artistic work of this century, not just comic books. It transcends to a different level.
Easily.
Thank you so much for your time. I know we went a little bit over. I really appreciate you humoring my questions about Bernie Wrightson. Is there anything else that you'd like to share, talk about, anything like that before we go?
I think we're good. I think, conversation's been a pleasure. I appreciate you having me on. It's a great job. Like I have to say, having, not many people get to have a 30+ year career in comics. So I feel very fortunate that I've been able to do this, and I'm still able to do this, and have really not wanted for work a day in the last 30 years. I know that's like winning the lottery. So I'm appreciative that I get to do this. I'm appreciative that people are still interested. Hopefully they'll be interested in Resolution, and we'll be able to make that. And there's more stuff coming.
All right, guys. Well, there will be links to the campaign in the description below. Make sure you go check it out. Once that gets funded, because I'm sure it will get funded, is it going to only be available from the campaign, or will people be able to purchase stuff from Zoop later on as well?
I think you can purchase stuff from Zoop. It's one of the attractions of Zoop is that it's going to hold some copies, and we'll be able to keep them moving. But if we don't make the goal, there won't be any copies, period. So pledge now. We've got it's a hardcover graphic novel, plus a making of companion book that's going to have the script and layouts and pencils and all of the behind the scenes stuff, and then a portfolio that goes along with it. It's got stuff by artists that, well, basically all of our friends that we lured in to help us with this. Liam Sharp, Phil Jimenez, Brian Hitch, Paul Pelletier, Ron Lim, Bart Sears, Peter Krause, a whole raft of people that are contributing pieces. It's nice to have friends you can depend on in this business.
I think it says a lot about you, though. Like, just speaking with you, it's been an absolute pleasure. I've wondered for a long time how you had such a prolific and ongoing career, not wanted for anything. And tonight has been a very, very pleasant learning experience of why. So,
It's very kind of you to say.
oh man, thank you so much for being on the channel. For anybody who's watching, again, there will be links to the campaign, which is live in the description below. If you're watching this a few months later, have no worries. I will also update the links so you can still buy the books. And I'll also stick some other cool Ron Marz links down there because he's got tons of sweet stuff that you guys should check out. So thanks so much for sticking with me. I hope you all enjoyed, and thank you again so much for doing this. I really appreciated it, man.
Happy to do it, man. Be safe.
Thanks so much for sticking with me. I hope you all enjoyed, maybe even learned something. If you did like what you saw, remember, hit that like button, get in the comment section below, and let me know. If you really enjoyed what you saw, make sure you Hulk smash that subscribe button. If you do that, make sure you ding the little notification bell so you never miss another video premiere again. If you feel like you're in a position to help the channel grow, think about signing up for my Patreon page using the link in the description below. You get access to tons of behind-the-scenes posts, full scripts, uncut interviews, exclusive content like the Discord channel, and even merchandise discount codes and a personal shout out on the channel. If you want to support the channel but Patreon isn't your thing, have no fear. After 2 years of fighting with YouTube and Google, I've finally been remonetized and can finally offer memberships here on YouTube, and you can make super chat donations during live premieres or sign up for membership. I also have a Ko-Fi page where you can make one-time donations towards specific goals or just tip the channel. And there's also a list of source materials that I'm seeking for future episodes that can be found on both Patreon and Ko-Fi. If that's not enough, there's also links to JerkComic shirts like the ones you see on the screen now, and tons of other merchandise in the description below as well. I just launched 2 new shirt designs, so swing by the Teespring store and check out the pieces by Emmy award-winning designer Thomas N. Perkins and the Canadian sensation himself, James Edward Clark. Thanks to every single one of you who signed up, bought shirts, donated, sent in books and equipment, and supports this channel in any way, shape, or form. I could not do these episodes without your help, and I seriously appreciate every single one of you. Speaking of which, this episode was brought to you by the Jerk Broadcasting System, as well as generous grants from the viewers you see on the screen now. I'd also like to personally thank my loyal Wednesday Warriors, Mike Dolan, Super Chasen, David Arroyo, Mike Dolan again, and a special thanks to Weapon X-Qual again for his donations, as well as David Arroyo and Alex Gaylor for their generous donation of source material this month. A big thanks to everyone who helps make this channel possible, including viewers like you. Thanks for sticking with me. I hope you enjoyed, maybe even learned something. And as always, I really, truly, and honestly ask only 2 things. Keep hitting those local shops and keep reading comics.